The irony in many ways is I call my work visible learning. Now learning, it's not that visible.
Yeah,
it's in the head.
Totally.
However, it's called that because I want to make that learning more visible to the student and to the teacher. I get frustrated when someone stands up in the staff room and said, John Hattie says X. It should be immediately follow, well, what's going on here? Why? What's happening? The climate of the class has to be high trust, not just between the teacher and the student, but between the students. There has to be a lot of safety nets for struggle. Struggle should be the most powerful, positive word in the classroom. There should be this confidence to take on challenges. When I look at teachers with high impact compared to teachers with lower impact, they think differently.
Podclass acknowledges the traditional and true custodians of the land we meet on here today, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. We're grateful to be here. Today, we're honoured to welcome the esteemed Professor John Hattie to the podcast. For those working in education, John Hattie is likely a familiar name, known worldwide for his research into what truly makes an impact in the classroom. John is a distinguished researcher, academic, and the mind behind visible learning, one of the largest evidence-based studies in education, which has redefined our understanding of teaching and learning by examining the factors that improve student outcomes. His work spans more than 20 years of research, with his recent book, Visible Learning: The Sequel, expanding on previous works. The sequel synthesizes over 2,100 meta-analyses, which draw from more than 130,000 individual studies and include data from over 400 million students worldwide. This is arguably the largest, most comprehensive analysis ever conducted in the field of education. John Hattie's focus is maximising impact in teaching. Hattie explores topics like teacher-student relationships, technology's role in learning, effective teaching frameworks, and delves into systematic educational questions like how school environments can evolve to better support impactful teaching and learning practices, and how educators can sustain growth beyond their early years in the profession. Reflecting on John Hattie's research, and having been surrounded by it my entire career, I find myself inspired by the clarity and depth he brings to understanding and evaluating research for educational outcomes. His commitment to grounding teaching practices in evidence and making that evidence accessible for all of us helps us to better connect, guide, and empower young learners. We couldn't be more grateful to have him here today.
So no one told you teaching was gonna be this way. Your lesson plans are jokes, your patience broke, you're feeling in disarray. It's like you're always stuck in report writing, when it hasn't been your day, your week, your month, or even your school year. But I'll be here for you
when the students start to riot.
I'll be here for you
even if your coffee's gone cold.
I'll be here for you 'cause you're there for them too.
Hello everyone, welcome back to Podclass, and we are excited because today we are joined in the studio by Professor John Hattie himself. Hello.
Great to be with you.
It's wonderful to be with you and also with myself, Amanda, Will and Skye. And we have just unpacked a little of your journey, which has obviously been long and thorough and detailed. And Skye and I were reflecting off air on when we first came to learn of you and of your research.
Yeah, and it feels a little bit surreal because I think you've just been this person that's been referred to so much in my university journey, in work staff meetings that are happening when I've been a teacher. And it's like John Hattie this and research this. And now to actually have you sitting here to unpack some of that, it just feels like a really full circle surreal moment for me.
Yeah, I feel exactly the same way.
Honestly, John, a few weeks ago, Amanda dropped your name and I have done a deep dive since then.
We would love to start today with learning a little about your personal mission and your philosophy around education. You know, it's no small feat to no small feat at all to, you know, travel the journey you've traveled and be arguably, you know, the greatest educational researcher that we have currently globally, with your research being implemented in tens and tens of thousands of schools across the world. What is your driving force, and more broadly, what is your philosophy?
Well, it's fun. It's actually fun delving down deeply into these ideas and being surprised, as I'm sure many teachers have been surprised when they've heard my name attached to something. I'm curious, so therefore the why question comes up. But I need to note that this has not been my career. This has been a hobby that I've had as a side event, which is, as you've indicated, taken over.
I mean, what a casual side event.
Yeah, it was. Like I'm a statistician, I'm a psychometrician. I teach those courses on research design and statistics that you loved, right?
Absolutely.
Yes, that's one word for it, loved.
And the beauty of that is it allowed me to dabble in lots of different areas. And right from the very beginning, like when I came into the business, almost as an outsider, because I was a teacher, but I was still seen as this nerdy numbers person, needed but kind of welcomed. And everybody told me exactly what I had to do if I was ever going to study education. And they all differed. And then every teacher I met, like you two, you can tell me exactly what your theory of teaching is and how things work, and you'll differ like crazy.
Yeah.
You know, that's true. And I've also never met a teacher who said they were below average. But we were kids once. We had some interesting teachers.
Yeah, I don't doubt it.
Yeah, and it's variable out there. And it didn't make sense to me that one side, the research is saying and the teachers are saying everything works.
Yep.
And it didn't make sense. At the same time, when I started my career in 1976, Jean Glass invented this thing called meta-analysis.
Cool. I just learned about meta-analysis as well.
So what is it, Will?
It's where you have multiple studies and there's so many studies that you can do a bigger study on all of the studies.
And it asks two questions. Firstly is, how big is the effect of what you're looking at? And secondly is, does that size of that effect differ in Melbourne and Shanghai and maths and music, etc.?
Based on the different studies.
Correct. And so you're right. It's a statistical synthesis of studies. Doesn't that sound exciting?
For you, John, I'm sure it is, which is why you do what you do.
And so I've been squirreling away for the last 40 years collecting these meta-analyses. And I'm up to 2,500 of them now. It allows me to have 400 million kids in the sample. And it's all on one Excel spreadsheet. Pretty
That
big
is
one,
wild. I can't even conceptualize what that looks like.
I mean, it must be the biggest research study, biggest analysis in existence of education.
Well, in terms of systematically reviewing the literature, it probably is. But again, about 8 or 9 years ago, I released all the data to save anyone else spending 40 years collected. So if anyone else wants the data, it's out there. It's MetaX, it's a free site. It's got all the data. We update it as new studies come in. And my challenge, and it comes back to the curious and curiouser, I want to know why. Why is it so? Why is it like this?
Yeah.
And that's the hard part. That's why it took me 20 odd years to write that first book, because I didn't understand the why. I get frustrated when someone stands up in the staff room and said, John Hattie says X. It should be immediately follow, well, what's going on here? Why? Well, what's happening?
Yeah.
Because
And I can
details.
speak for us, like we've sat in those staff meetings and we've sat in those lecture halls, but we've gone, all right, so the biggest effect size that's been proven, and this is John Hattie's research, so this is the gospel, is, so for this term, we're focusing entirely, the entire school focus is shifting to feedback.
But really, it's not John Hattie saying it's the 400 million young people.
Yes and no, it's that, but I do take responsibility for saying things, and sometimes I didn't say them as clear as I should be, and that's why I keep going, to try and get the message right.
And so, interestingly, from your first book in 2009, Visible Learning, you've re-released new research with now an effect size, 400 million students. And in your initial book, we've all, a lot of us have seen the chart and the rating of the effect sizes, and you have removed that. And my understanding is that that's due to the creation of misunderstandings through having ranked them. We were also listening in prep to some other podcasts you've done, and one of the things you said was you have some of the best critics in the world.
I do.
And that they teach you so much. So are you able to talk to, why you removed that ranking and what have been some of the biggest criticisms and misconceptions about your work?
Well, firstly, Amanda, as an academic, you thrive on critique. In fact, I love the New Zealand definition of a university. It's the critic and conscience of society. Wow. And so it does obligate you to listen to that critique. And sometimes it's personal, and that's very unpleasant. Most times it's about your ideas, which is as it should be. And I've learned a lot from the critics. I don't always agree with them, but I have learned a lot from the critics. And one of the things that I certainly started to notice in the early years of doing this is that league table of rankings. It attracted attention.
Yeah.
It really did.
And for that, I don't regret it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, I like it.
However,
And would visible learning have been so saturated without that ranking table?
Yeah, and these conversations
so.
have now been opened up to actually really dive deep into our practice and what does work and what should be taking place in schools. And maybe we wouldn't have had such a close analysis had that not happened.
oh, look, visible learning was my 10th book. What happened to the previous 9? And I think the other thing is when I finished what I thought was the final draft, my biggest critic, my wife read it, and she said, which 3 people in the world will read this? Oh. And, that was really hurt.
It's Janet, right? Your wife? Shout out to Janet for
Keeping
really
us on
holding you
our toes.
accountable in that way.
And so given it was my 4th version and I was happy with it, I said, well, what do I do? So she invented the thermometers, the barometers, to give it a flow through. And then I, at the last minute, added the rankings as an appendix. And then what happened over the next few years is, people said, and you said it yourself, they took the things at the top and said, we're going to do those.
Yeah.
And they particularly picked off the odd one, like feedback or whatever it was. And they looked at the stuff at the bottom, we're not doing that stuff.
It's not effective. We can't
No.
touch it. Yeah.
But then some of that stuff at the bottom should worry the heck out of us.
Yeah.
Like, what subject did you teach?
I was an English and media teacher.
English media?
Primary school teacher.
Primary school. English and media. Are you shocked that subject matter knowledge has an incredibly close to zero effect size?
Yes.
And we should firstly accept the evidence. It does have a close to zero effect. And then ask why. And in fact, I've spent 15 years of my life trying to understand the why, and I think I do now when we can come back to that. But my point being is because they're low doesn't mean they're not important. Homework in primary school, zero effect. Doesn't mean you get rid of it, means you improve it. You understand why high school homework's effective, why primary. And so that league table I abolished about 8 or 9 years ago. And I changed the theme to know thy impact. Because the argument is my work is about the research that has happened. And it looks at probability statements. If you do these things, you have a high probability of them being successful. What matters is how you implement them, the fidelity of that, the impact of that. And for goodness sake, if you implement something and it doesn't work, I don't care what the research says, stop it.
Yeah.
And I remember going to England and meeting the Minister of Education in England there, and he was very, very happy, and he was a happy chappy and a buoyant chap, and he bounced into the room and said, oh, you'll be so pleased, John. Next year I'm decreeing England as the year of feedback. And I said to him, well, Minister, what happens the year after? You don't do it?
Yeah.
The meeting stopped about 5 minutes later. He was very angry with me. But still, it's kind of like, as we were talking, feedback is a very powerful notion, but it's tied up with so many other things. A third of feedback's negative. So if you implement feedback and you do it wrong, you're doing destructive. So we stopped that league table. You won't find it produced by any of us anywhere over the last 7 or 8 years. I know it's still out there and it's very dated, and I know if you go to the meta-X website, you can create your own, but it misses the point. It's the overlap of the many ideas that matter. And I'm still searching for that big kernel of an idea that underlies those now 400 different influences.
And it is, and it's kind of that idea, right? If we take the ticker box thing, if we implement those things at the top of the list and we just do that, our teaching practice will be great. All of our students will be hitting their achievement standards and outcomes that we want for them. And we just know that that's not the case. And I think so much of your work actually does, particularly in your new book, really looks at just how much diversity there is in that space, how much difference there is. I mean, you mentioned it yourself at the start. You don't have the same conversation with every teacher that you meet. Everyone has different philosophies and ideas about what works and what doesn't.
And every classroom and school has different variables, which influence all of the factors
But this
as
all
well.
upset you.
Go on.
We were talking with Will before about meta-analysis having the size of the effect, and then it asks, are there moderators, are there things that matter? They're almost impossible to find. It really doesn't matter. Oh my gosh, it doesn't matter who your students are.
Yeah. Which a lot of teachers listening to this will be like, how dare you say that? Of course it matters.
Well,
who our
Could you
students
please-
are.
like city?
Could you please say more?
Well, worldwide, except for a huge part of the world which is third world countries, which I now know is officially called Global South, which is a weird phrase given we live in Australia, but that's the phrase. Those countries, it's a different story. But in the developed world, where the resources are happening, it's very, very, very hard to find an individual difference for a kid. Now, that doesn't mean to say your kids are not unique. They are. What matters is that what works best for special ed, for gifted, for maths and music, etc. And that upsets a lot of teachers. I know it does, but I'm sorry, that's the evidence.
So this is, I guess, where it comes in, because we look a lot in teaching around differentiation and how you've got 25 students in your class, they've all got unique learning needs, meeting those needs. So, but what we actually can say is that perhaps the evidence shows us statistically that that's not the case.
Let's think of it in a different way. Every kid's special. So special education applies to everybody.
Yeah.
What works in special education works for all kids. What works for all kids doesn't necessarily work for an individual. What also is that individuals differ in terms of their willingness to take on challenges. And that turns out to be amongst the most critical dimensions. Much more important than whether they're Aboriginal or white, whether they're 7 or whether they're 20. The ability not to be distracted turns out to be very critical. And then you come back to the teacher, and one of the major findings is it's not what teachers do that matters. It's how they think about what they do. And like you've been in probably hundreds of professional learning programs where someone's got up and says, this is what I do. These are my resources. Watch me teach. And I think they're an incredibly destructive waste of time. I want to know how that teacher's thinking. And my big work at the moment.
Why are they making the choices that they're making?
Particularly not just when they're sitting in the staff room, but those moment-by-moment decisions you make when you're in the classroom.
Yeah, which there's hundreds of them. Every single lesson, there's hundreds and hundreds of choices we make with
and
every
when you
lesson.
make choices, you make priorities.
Yes.
And like at the moment, I'm using this notion of evaluative thinking and exploring that. Like I've been looking at the various mind frames of teachers, the ways they think. Then I said, well, sadly, I've got too many of those now. I have mind frames for teachers, leaders, parents, students, special ed, assessment,
That's a whole other Excel spreadsheet that we won't go into.
So I said, well, what's underlying all that? And it's this notion of evaluative thinking. And I've explored it. And again, my biggest critic, who happens to be a professor of evaluation.
Not your wife.
Yeah.
Oh, still your wife.
Yeah.
His wife.
Still Janet.
She said, you've made it too complicated. So I said, well, what do I say? And she said, well, evaluative thinkers are nosy. Now, you know those teachers. Well, you had them.
Yeah.
They really want to know how you think. They want to know what's going on. They want to know why you're sitting there daydreaming. They want to know why you're struggling.
And I'm always more curious on why they want to know.
Right, but their job is to make it safe for you to talk about what you know and particularly about what you don't know. And that's a really, really powerful notion. Like feedback thrives on errors. No kid goes to a classroom to learn that which they know. And there's the problem. Many kids want to do what they can already do.
Yeah.
So does everyone. And we all like things that we're good at.
We're safe at.
Yeah.
And this notion of errors turns out to be critical. And so this notion of evaluative thinking, trying to understand where you're stuck. Go back to what we were saying before. I bet, teachers, you could talk for hours about your theory of learning. Your theory of teaching.
Totally.
What's your theory of learning? Because that's what your kids are obsessed with. They don't care about your teaching. They care about learning. And when I do an analysis of 20,000 hours of classroom observation and ask how many times does a teacher think aloud, or how many times does a teacher ask a kid to think aloud, I found 0.
In 20,000 hours.
What was it in your class?
I don't know. I think as an English teacher, like discussion is such an important part of, for me, that's my teaching, philosophy and how I love to run classrooms is having young people be able to have their voice and to hear their thinking process. But I think I speak for a lot of teachers when we ask a young person maybe how they're thinking or how they came up with that idea or whatever it might be. And our most common response we'd get from a student is, I don't know.
Yeah.
So in that space, we then have to, as educators, be able to go deeper and help guide that student to actually have that metacognition of how they got to the point that they've got to, or they've got to the thing that's written in front of them. But that's not.
Ask you, how do you learn?
How do I learn personally? I don't know, through thinking, through thinking about the.
You nearly said, I don't know, like I shouldn't.
Yeah, I nearly said, I don't know.
But is it like fear of being wrong as well? from the
Yeah.
But I also
point
think
is
it's like a muscle we haven't strengthened, to be reflecting on how we achieve certain outcomes and how we get to certain processes. And this episode is all about knowing your impact. So my curiosity, John, is if you could share something with Australian teachers, with Australian schools about knowing your impact, what would you share? Because there's a real distinction you've just made. And I feel like, we can really it's around your impact, and it's around possibly a misconception around where our deepest impact comes from when it actually comes from a different place.
Like, the argument is that even as adults, even as professionals in the area, we struggle with the language of learning.
Yeah.
And when you're a student in a classroom, your focus is on learning.
Yes.
And it's a silent conversation. And the irony in many ways is I call my work visible learning. Now, learning, I've just said, it's not that visible.
Yeah,
it's in the head.
totally.
However, it's called that because I want to make that learning more visible to the student and to the teacher.
Yeah.
Yes.
I want more in the classroom about thinking aloud, the safety to say, I don't know.
Yeah.
Like in any class, it should be common that kids don't know. Otherwise, they're learning stuff they're never doing.
Of course.
Because they don't know, the climate of the class has to be high trust, not just between the teacher and the student, but between the students. There has to be a lot of safety nets for struggle. Struggle should be the most powerful, positive word in the classroom. There should be this confidence to take on challenges. And this is where the whole visible learning comes back to, is these kind of notions about how teachers set up these classrooms with these climates, how they can then appropriately challenge, because what's appropriately challenging for Amanda may not be appropriately challenging for Will. That's the art of teaching.
Yeah.
Knowing your reaction to failure is a key part of being a teacher that we often forget. And so that often very personal side of teaching is one of the essences. And the whole notion of knowing your impact is to know that impact that you're having as a teacher on the ways of thinking, the learning strategies of the kids. Now, there's no doubt that learning is about something.
Yes.
So the content does matter.
Yes.
Even though learning about learning, thinking about thinking is a key part of what we should be doing. And I want a lot more time in the classroom where teachers actually hear kids thinking, because I'm sitting there in the classroom not knowing. I want to know how you did it.
Yeah.
I want to know what processes you went through. And when I, in our science of learning research, get inside your brain, it ain't linear.
Yeah.
It ain't. There's the answer.
Definitely not.
We flit.
Yes.
We have error management.
Yes.
Some kids don't.
So I'm so curious now on like the way that I learn, and I think that's a really good challenge for like us three as we go home today, but also as you drive home at the end of this episode. How do you learn?
Yeah. And where are we creating space to share our thinking? Where are we creating space to hear the thinking? Because what we think about what we do, the research tells us, has more profound effect on student learning than actually what we do. Is that right?
I want to take it one step further.
Please do.
Not only in the classroom, but also in the staff room. How those teachers think. Like when I look at teachers with high impact compared to teachers with lower impact, they think differently. It's not what they do the same stuff. They teach the same ways.
Would you be willing to share an example in this moment? Like if we're thinking about an everyday, like a scenario where, for example, we might have prepared the same resources, we might have the same learning intention and success criteria, we might go about it technically the same way, and yet the impact is different.
Good example is differentiation.
Yeah.
Teachers with low impact think differentiation is different activities for different groups of kids,
Okay.
which therefore reinforces low expectations, doesn't give the kids the chance of challenge, and they not only never catch up, they fall behind.
And also from a teaching perspective, if that's what you believe differentiation is, creates pressure, time, like it's all of those other things get stacked on as well if that's our mindset.
Teachers with high impact think differentiation is setting similar success criteria for all the kids, but allowing different ways at different times to get there. A totally different way of thinking.
Because when our students succeed, that's when we succeed as teachers. And so we need to be creating those opportunities for them to think through that.
Well, also, like if you're traveling from Sydney to Melbourne, you could go down the Hume Highway, which probably 80% would. You can do the coast road. You can go inland. No road's wrong.
Yeah.
They take different ways and different times. That's differentiation.
Yeah.
But that's not how it's seen. It's a totally different way of thinking about what you're doing, which reflects in your activities. Expectations. Teachers with high expectations have dramatically different classrooms from teachers with low expectations because of a way of thinking.
Amazing.
That's so good.
Thank you.
This has been the episode about knowing your impact. You have impact. How you think has so much impact, and how you analyze and implement that thinking in the classroom.
And I think probably one of the biggest takeaways is, just as John's kind of spoken about, is getting curious about how your students are thinking, how they're getting to what they're getting to in class, and providing more opportunities to hear that out loud, to hear them going through those processes.
And in the best news of the day, John is also with us next week. We are Podclass, and we'll see you very soon.
See you soon. Bye.
I'll be here for you, 'cause you're there for them too.
Thanks so much for tuning into Podclass. If you've enjoyed this episode, we would adore it if you could go on to Spotify, Apple Music, wherever you listen to your podcasts, and leave us a review. 5 stars would be lovely. We would love to get this podcast into as many ears as possible so we can help and support as many people as possible who help young people. And if you're not already doing so, please go along to Instagram and follow us at podclass.aus.